CN Tower's 360 restaurant rotated slowly above Toronto's glittering skyline, each revolution offering a new perspective of Lake Ontario stretching toward the horizon like liquid obsidian. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across tables draped in pristine white linen, where 150 of Canada's most influential business leaders sipped Dom Perignon and whispered about quarterly projections. But tonight wasn't about business. Tonight was about love, or at least what passed for love in the rarefied air of Toronto's elite circles. Celeste Thorne stood at the head table, her midnight blue Valentino gown catching the light as she surveyed the room she'd rented for what everyone believed would be her engagement announcement. At 38, she was Canada's youngest female tech CEO, the architect of Thorne Innovations' meteoric rise from garage startup to $200 million sustainable energy empire. Her dark hair was swept into an elegant chignon, her posture radiating the kind of confident authority that had graced the covers of Forbes and Canadian Business. Beside her, 9-year-old Phoenix fidgeted with the knot of his bow tie, his intelligent green eyes scanning the crowd with the careful assessment of someone far older than his years. He wore a miniature tuxedo that cost more than most people's monthly rent, but something in his expression suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. The 5 men who'd spent the past 6 months competing for Celeste's hand stood at strategic positions throughout the room, each one a masterpiece of masculine achievement. Dr. Atlas Morrison, whose surgical precision had saved countless children's lives. Ronan Blackwood, whose investment strategies had built fortunes for Toronto's wealthiest families. Ezra Wellington, whose art gallery had become the cultural heartbeat of the city. Dashiell Frost, whose Olympic medal gleamed almost as brightly as his television career. Quinlan Reid, whose environmental law practice had made him the conscience of corporate Canada. Any woman would be lucky to marry one of them. That's what everyone said. That's what made sense. Celeste lifted her champagne flute, the crystal singing softly as she tapped it with her wedding ring, the one she'd never removed, even 3 years after her divorce. The conversations gradually died as attention turned toward the head table. "Ladies and gentlemen," Celeste began, her voice carrying the same commanding presence that had intimidated boardrooms full of venture capitalists. "Thank you for joining us tonight for what I hope will be a celebration of new beginnings and—" "Mom." Phoenix's voice cut through her carefully rehearsed speech like a blade through silk. He'd stepped forward to the microphone, his small hands gripping the stand with determination that made Celeste's breath catch. The room fell into the kind of silence that felt dangerous, like the moment before lightning strikes. Camera flashes paused mid-click. Wine glasses froze halfway to lips. Even the soft jazz quartet seemed to miss a note. Phoenix looked out at the sea of expectant faces, his gaze moving past the 5 accomplished men who'd spent months trying to win his approval, past the reporters with their notebooks ready to chronicle Toronto's most eligible bachelorette's romantic choice, until his eyes found something at the back of the room that made his face transform with sudden, radiant clarity. "I know who I want to be my new dad," Phoenix announced, his young voice carrying clearly through the restaurant's sophisticated sound system. "But he's not here tonight. He's 37 floors down, cleaning this building so people like us can have fancy dinners." The silence that followed was so complete that Celeste could hear her own heartbeat, thundering in her ears, could hear the distant hum of Toronto traffic far below, could hear the soft whisper of expensive fabric as 150 people held their breath and waited for the world to make sense again. Phoenix continued, oblivious to the shock rippling through the crowd like seismic waves. "His name is Kieran Walsh, and he's taught me more about being a good person than anyone in this room." But to understand how a 9-year-old boy could bring Toronto's elite to stunned silence with a handful of honest words, we need to go back to where this impossible story really began. Not in boardrooms or matchmaking offices, but in the fluorescent-lit hallways of Thorne Innovations Tower, where 2 lonely souls found each other in the most unlikely place imaginable. Have you ever watched a child speak truth that adults were too afraid to say? Keep watching to see how one 9-year-old's courage changed everything for 2 families who needed each other more than they knew. 5 years earlier, Celeste Thorne had been hunched over a workbench in a converted garage in Toronto's Leslieville neighborhood, her pregnant belly making it impossible to get close enough to the prototype battery she was assembling. The November wind rattled the thin walls, and she could see her breath in the unheated space. But her hands remained steady as she connected delicate wiring that could revolutionize sustainable energy storage. "You're going to freeze to death out here," Julian had said from the doorway, designer coffee in hand, expensive overcoat unbuttoned because he'd only stepped outside long enough to deliver his opinion. Her husband's handsome face wore the expression of patient exasperation she'd grown to dread. The look of a man who'd married an interesting woman and now found her interests inconvenient. The heating bill was $300 last month, Celeste had replied without looking up from her work. "I'd rather be cold than broke." Julian had sighed, the sound carrying all his disappointment in her choices. "Celeste, sweetheart, you're 7 months pregnant. This isn't the time to be playing inventor in a garage. My father's offered you a position at Wellington Holdings. Stable salary, excellent benefits, perfect timing for maternity leave." But Celeste had seen something in those battery cells that Julian couldn't understand. She'd seen the future. Electric vehicles that could drive for 1,000 kilometers on a single charge, solar grids that could store enough energy to power cities through winter nights, a world where clean energy wasn't just possible, but profitable. She'd also seen the bank statements, the mounting bills, the investor meetings that had ended with polite rejections and patronizing advice to focus on the family for now. The reality that in 4 months she'd have a baby to feed and a dream that might die if she couldn't make it financially viable soon. "I believe in this, Julian," she'd said, finally looking up to meet his eyes. "These batteries could change everything." Julian had shaken his head, the gesture carrying 5 years of accumulated frustration. "What I don't understand is why changing everything is more important to you than taking care of what you already have." The night Phoenix was born, during 18 hours of labor that Julian spent mostly in the hospital corridor making business calls, Celeste had stared into her son's impossibly green eyes and made a promise that would shape both their lives forever. She would build something lasting, something that would give him security and opportunity, and a mother he could be proud of. She would prove that dreams were worth fighting for, even when everyone else called them impossible. Julian had lasted exactly 13 more months, long enough to see Thorne Innovations secure its first major funding round, long enough to realize that his wife's garage project was going to require years of sacrifice and uncertainty, long enough to decide that being married to an entrepreneur was nothing like being married to the idea of one. He'd left on a Tuesday morning in February, claiming he needed space to figure things out. The divorce papers arrived 6 weeks later, along with a custody arrangement that gave him alternating weekends and holidays, time he'd used exactly twice before moving to Vancouver and starting fresh with someone who didn't expect him to share her impossible dreams. The next 3 years had blurred together in a haze of 18-hour days, investor pitches, and the kind of relentless forward momentum that left no room for grief or second-guessing. Celeste had moved Phoenix and herself into a modest apartment in downtown Toronto, hired Mrs. Patterson as a live-in nanny, and thrown herself into building Thorne Innovations with the desperate energy of someone who understood that failure would hurt more than just herself. The breakthrough had come during Phoenix's 3rd year, when automotive giant Magna International signed an exclusive licensing deal for Celeste's battery technology. Suddenly, the woman working out of a converted garage had become the CEO of Canada's most promising clean tech company. The modest apartment became a penthouse in Yorkville. Mrs. Patterson was joined by housekeepers and tutors and assistants whose job was to ensure that Phoenix's life ran with clockwork precision. But somewhere, between the magazine covers and the industry awards, between the board meetings and the international expansion, Celeste had lost track of something essential. She'd gained the whole world, in the biblical sense, but when she looked at her 6-year-old son, polite, well-behaved, and strangely distant, she wondered what she'd lost in the bargain. The warning signs had been subtle at first. Phoenix's teacher mentioning that he preferred working alone on group projects. His tendency to treat conversations like business meetings, asking direct questions and providing efficient answers without the meandering curiosity that characterized most children his age. The way he'd started scheduling his own activities, keeping a color-coded calendar that would have impressed most executives. But it was the parade of nannies that finally forced Celeste to confront the reality she'd been avoiding. Mrs. Patterson had lasted until Phoenix turned 7, leaving when her own grandchildren needed care. Her replacement, a lovely woman named Sarah, had quit after 6 months, citing philosophical differences about child development. Then came Maria, who'd lasted 4 months before accepting a position with a family that had more realistic expectations about work-life balance. The 7th nanny, Dr. Elizabeth Chen, had lasted exactly 3 weeks before requesting a meeting that Celeste would remember for the rest of her life. "Your son is remarkable," Dr. Chen had said, sitting across from Celeste in the penthouse's pristine living room, while Phoenix attended his Mandarin lesson in the next room. "He's brilliant, articulate, and mature beyond his years. He's also building emotional walls that would impress most corporate executives." Celeste had felt her chest tighten. "What do you mean?" "He treats every interaction like a transaction," Dr. Chen had explained with the gentle directness of someone trained in child psychology. "He's polite because politeness gets results. He's compliant because compliance avoids conflict. But Mrs. Thorne, I don't think I've seen him really laugh once in 3 weeks." That night, after Dr. Chen had packed her belongings and wished them well, Celeste had sat in Phoenix's doorway, watching her son complete his homework with methodical precision. His bedroom was a masterpiece of organization, books arranged by subject and height, toys displayed but obviously unused, a desk setup that would have made Fortune 500 executives weep with envy. "Phoenix," she'd said softly, "how was school today?" "Productive," he'd replied without looking up from his mathematics worksheet. "I completed the week's assignments ahead of schedule and helped Jeremy Chen understand fractions during recess." "Did you have fun?" Phoenix had paused his pencil, considering the question with the seriousness of someone analyzing a complex problem. "Fun seems like an inefficient use of time, Mom. I'd rather focus on learning." Celeste had closed her eyes, recognizing her own words echoed back in her 9-year-old son's voice. She'd built him a perfect life, the best schools, the finest opportunities, complete financial security. But somehow, she'd forgotten to build him a childhood. Dr. Evelyn Sterling's office overlooked Toronto's financial district, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the towers where Celeste had built her empire. The therapist herself was everything Celeste respected, accomplished, direct, and expensive enough that her time felt valuable. "You're describing a child who's learned to survive by becoming what he thinks you need him to be," Dr. Sterling had explained after Celeste outlined Phoenix's concerning behavior. "He's brilliant enough to understand that his mother is under enormous pressure, so he's trying to reduce that pressure by requiring as little emotional maintenance as possible." "But I don't want him to be low maintenance," Celeste had protested. "I want him to be happy." "Then you need to show him what happiness looks like," Dr. Sterling had said simply. "And Mrs. Thorne, you might want to consider that Phoenix needs more than academic enrichment and efficient scheduling. Research consistently shows that children, especially boys from single-parent homes, benefit significantly from positive male role models." The suggestion had hit Celeste like a physical blow. She'd worked so hard to prove that she could be both mother and father to Phoenix, that they could be a complete family unit without needing anyone else's help. The idea that her best efforts might not be enough felt like admitting failure at the only job that truly mattered. "What are you suggesting?" Celeste had asked. Dr. Sterling had smiled with professional warmth. "I'm suggesting that perhaps it's time to consider expanding your definition of family. Phoenix doesn't need another parent, necessarily, but he might benefit from another adult who can offer him a different perspective on what it means to be a man in this world." That conversation had led Celeste to Cambridge & Associates, Toronto's most exclusive matchmaking service. If she was going to find Phoenix a father figure, she reasoned, She might as well approach it with the same strategic thinking that had built Thorne Innovations. What she hadn't expected was that the answer to her carefully calculated problem would find her first, 37 floors below her corner office, in the fluorescent-lit hallways where Toronto's invisible workforce kept the business world running smoothly. Single parents, you know this struggle, trying to give your child everything while missing what they need most. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. Cambridge & Associates occupied a discreet suite of offices in Toronto's prestigious First Canadian Place, where oil paintings of previous successful matches lined mahogany-paneled walls and fresh orchids perfumed the air with expensive subtlety. Victoria Cambridge herself was a masterpiece of professional competence, Harvard MBA, former McKinsey consultant, and the kind of woman who charged $50,000 retainers because her success rate justified every penny. Mrs. Thorne, Victoria had said, settling behind a desk that probably cost more than most people's cars, finding a suitable partner for someone of your stature requires careful consideration. We're not just matching personalities, we're aligning life trajectories, financial goals, and most importantly for your situation, parenting philosophies. She'd slid a leather portfolio across the polished surface, 5 photographs smiling up at Celeste with the kind of calculated charm that graced dating app profiles. But these weren't ordinary dating prospects. These were men whose accomplishments could fill museum displays, whose bank accounts could fund small countries, whose social connections could open doors that most people didn't even know existed. Each candidate has been thoroughly vetted. Victoria had continued with the confidence of someone who'd built a career on reading people's deepest desires. Financial background checks, psychological assessments, compatibility analyses based on your completed questionnaires. More importantly, each has expressed genuine interest in immediate family building with a partner who shares his values and ambitions. Dr. Atlas Morrison commanded attention even in a photograph. At 41, he was Toronto's most sought-after pediatric surgeon, the man parents prayed would be available when their children faced life-threatening medical crises. His Greek heritage had gifted him with classical features, sharp cheekbones, dark eyes that suggested both intelligence and intensity, silver threading through black hair in a way that made him look distinguished rather than aging. Dr. Morrison has saved over 2,000 children's lives, Victoria had explained as Celeste studied his profile. Never married by choice. He's been waiting for the right woman to build a family with. His approach to relationships mirrors his surgical philosophy. Careful planning, precise execution, optimal outcomes. Atlas's credentials read like a medical school's dream recruitment brochure. Johns Hopkins Medical School, residency at Mayo Clinic, fellowships in London and Geneva. He spoke 4 languages fluently, served on the boards of 3 children's charities, and had pioneered surgical techniques that were now used worldwide. Their first meeting had taken place at Canoe, Toronto's most exclusive restaurant, where Atlas had arrived precisely on time, wearing a Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. He'd greeted Phoenix with the kind of professional warmth he probably used with young patients, interested but clinical, engaging but emotionally distant. Children respond well to structured interaction protocols, Atlas had explained to Celeste over their appetizers, while Phoenix quietly colored in a sketchbook. Clear expectations, consistent boundaries, logical consequences. The key is creating an environment where intellectual development can flourish without emotional volatility. Phoenix had looked up from his drawing, a detailed sketch of the restaurant's view of Lake Ontario, and asked, "Do you like kids, Dr. Atlas?" "I dedicate my life to helping children achieve optimal health outcomes," Atlas had replied with practiced sincerity. "Every day, I have the privilege of using my skills to ensure young people like yourself can reach their full potential." It was the kind of answer that sounded impressive to adults, but left children with more questions than they'd started with. Ronan Blackwood carried grief like expensive cologne, noticeable but not overwhelming, adding depth to his presence without defining it entirely. At 39, he'd built Blackwood Capital into one of Canada's most successful investment firms, but his greatest accomplishment was surviving the loss of his wife to breast cancer 3 years earlier, while raising twin boys who were now Phoenix's age. Mr. Blackwood understands loss, Victoria had noted, which gives him unique insight into blended family dynamics. He's also one of Bay Street's most respected minds, the kind of strategic thinker who could complement your business acumen while providing Phoenix with a father figure who truly understands the complexities of modern parenting. Ronan's office occupied the top floor of a King Street tower, its windows offering panoramic views of Toronto's financial district. The walls displayed photographs of his sons playing hockey, skiing, and Whistler, graduating from summer programs at exclusive camps. But it was the single-framed photo on his desk, a family portrait taken months before his wife's diagnosis, that revealed the depth of what he'd lost and rebuilt. Grief is like portfolio management, Ronan had told Celeste during their lunch at the Toronto club, his Irish accent adding musical notes to words that might have sounded clinical from someone else. You can't avoid risk entirely, but you can diversify your emotional investments to minimize catastrophic loss. He'd spoken about his boys with obvious love tempered by strategic thinking. Sean and Connor have taught me that children need structure within flexibility, security within adventure. They've helped me understand that being a single parent isn't about replacing what's missing. It's about building something new that honors what came before. Phoenix had met the twins at a Blue Jays game, where Ronan had secured a private box and provided enough baseball statistics to satisfy even the most analytically minded 9-year-old. The boys had gotten along well in the polite way of children whose parents were watching for compatibility signs, but Celeste had noticed that Phoenix spent most of the game taking notes about batting averages rather than simply enjoying the experience. Ezra Wellington moved through Toronto's cultural landscape like he'd been born to it, which, in many ways, he had been. At 43, he owned 3 of the city's most prestigious art galleries, had curated exhibitions that traveled internationally, and possessed the kind of refined sophistication that made opera galas and museum fundraisers feel like natural habitats rather than social obligations. Mr. Wellington represents cultural sophistication, Victoria had noted with obvious approval. He's the kind of man who could provide Phoenix with exposure to beauty, creativity, and the finer aspects of human achievement. His gallery network spans 3 continents, and he's personally responsible for launching the careers of over 40 internationally recognized artists. Ezra's Yorkville Gallery was a temple to aesthetic perfection, where carefully curated lighting made even casual visitors feel like they were witnessing something sacred. He possessed the gift of making art accessible without dumbing it down, explaining complex concepts in ways that made listeners feel intelligent rather than ignorant. Beauty shapes the soul. Ezra had told Phoenix during their private tour of his latest exhibition featuring Canadian landscape painters. When you grow up surrounded by human creativity at its highest level, you develop an appreciation for excellence that influences every aspect of your life. He'd knelt down to Phoenix's eye level in front of a group of 7 painting, his enthusiasm genuine and infectious. "What do you see in this piece?" Phoenix had studied the canvas with the intensity he brought to mathematics problems. "I see trees and rocks and water, but the way the light hits the lake makes it look like it's moving even though it's just paint." Ezra's face had lit up with the joy of someone sharing a beloved secret. "Exactly. You've just discovered the magic of art, the way human skill can make static materials come alive with emotion and energy." But when they'd moved to the sculpture garden, Phoenix had asked, "Mr. Ezra, do you think making beautiful things is more important than making useful things?" The question had stopped Ezra mid-sentence, revealing perhaps the first crack in his polished presentation. Dashiell Frost entered rooms like he was still skating onto Olympic ice. Confident, graceful, and absolutely certain that he belonged there. At 37, he transitioned from professional hockey to sports broadcasting with the kind of seamless success that made it look effortless. But his athletic discipline remained evident in everything from his morning workout routine to his approach to problem-solving. "Mr. Frost brings energy and physicality to the equation," Victoria had explained, showing Celeste action shots from his Olympic career alongside more recent photos from his television work. "He understands competition, teamwork, and the kind of mental toughness that builds character. For a boy like Phoenix, who's been raised in a very cerebral environment, exposure to athletic thinking could be tremendously beneficial. Dashiell's approach to potential fatherhood was exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd spent his career turning individual talent into team success. He'd taken Phoenix to his old training facility, where they'd spent an afternoon learning basic hockey skills on a private rink that had once hosted Olympic preparation camps. "Every boy needs to understand what his body can do," Dashiell had explained as he showed Phoenix how to hold a hockey stick properly. "Confidence comes from knowing you can handle physical challenges, that you're strong enough to protect yourself and others." Phoenix had surprised everyone by taking to skating naturally, his analytical mind quickly grasping the physics of balance and momentum. But when Dashiell had suggested they work on checking techniques, Phoenix had asked, "Why would I want to hit someone who's just trying to play the same game I am?" The question had led to a surprisingly deep conversation about competition versus cooperation, winning versus participating, and whether physical strength was meant for dominance or protection. Quinlan Reed possessed the kind of quiet intensity that made people lean closer when he spoke, not because his voice was soft, but because his words carried the weight of absolute conviction. At 40, he built one of Canada's most successful environmental law practices, taking on cases that pitted corporate profits against planetary survival, and winning often enough to make himself wealthy while making powerful enemies. "Mr. Reed shares your commitment to sustainable business practices," Victoria had noted, clearly pleased with this particular match. "He's the kind of man who could understand your industry pressures while supporting your environmental mission." From a values alignment perspective, this pairing could be extraordinarily harmonious. Quinlan's office occupied a converted heritage building in Toronto's Distillery District, its exposed brick walls lined with awards from environmental organizations and photographs from legal victories that had protected wilderness areas across Canada. He possessed the rare combination of idealistic passion and pragmatic strategy that made him both dreamer and warrior. Their dinner conversation had ranged across topics that most people avoided on first dates: climate change, corporate responsibility, the ethical implications of wealth accumulation. But rather than feeling heavy, the discussion had energized Celeste in ways she hadn't experienced since her early days building Thorn Innovations. "Phoenix," Quinlan had said during dessert, addressing the 9-year-old with the same seriousness he brought to adult conversations. "What do you think is the most important challenge facing your generation?" Phoenix had considered the question with characteristic intensity. "I think it's figuring out how to fix the mistakes adults made without making new ones, while we're trying to fix the old ones." The answer had stopped conversation at nearby tables, where other diners had turned to stare at this impossibly articulate child who spoke like a philosophy professor trapped in a 9-year-old's body. Each man was remarkable in his own way. Each brought something unique to the theoretical family they could build together. Each seemed genuinely interested in not just marrying Celeste, but in becoming a meaningful presence in Phoenix's life. So why did Celeste feel like she was shopping for a car rather than choosing a life partner? Why did each interaction, despite the obvious compatibility and mutual respect, leave her feeling more isolated rather than more connected? The answer, she would later realize, was already working 37 floors below her corner office, mopping floors and emptying trash cans with the quiet dignity of someone who understood that respect was earned through character rather than credentials. But first, Phoenix would have to help her see what she'd been missing. At 5:47 a.m., while Toronto's business elite slept in Egyptian cotton sheets and temperature-controlled bedrooms, Kieran Walsh pushed through the revolving doors of First Canadian Place with a wheeled cart that had seen better decades and a security badge that granted him access to some of the most powerful offices in Canada. The lobby stretched before him like a marble cathedral, its soaring ceilings and polished surfaces designed to make visitors feel both impressed and insignificant. But Kieran saw it differently. He saw 40,000 square feet of flooring that would need to be cleaned before the first executive arrived at 7 a.m. He saw elevator banks that would require polishing, windows that would need washing, and trash receptacles that would need emptying before Toronto's decision-makers began their daily business of moving money and making deals. Kieran was 34, though the weight of recent years had carved lines around his green eyes that belonged on an older man's face. His dark hair was cut short and practical, his work uniform pressed despite being purchased second-hand, and his steel-toed boots resoled twice because new ones weren't in the budget. He moved through the building's corridors with economic efficiency, wasting no motion, completing each task with the methodical precision of someone who understood that excellence was a choice, not an accident. 3 years earlier, Kieran had occupied a corner office 20 floors above where he now worked. As a senior aerospace engineer at Bombardier, he'd been responsible for designing safety systems that kept passengers alive at 35,000 feet, earning a salary that had supported a comfortable life in Toronto's Rosedale neighborhood. His business cards had read, Senior Systems Engineer, his parking spot had been reserved, and his opinion had carried the kind of weight that came with advanced degrees and specialized knowledge. The morning that changed everything had started like any other. Kieran had arrived at his office with coffee and Danish, ready to review the latest test data from the CS-300 aircraft program. But as he'd studied the results from the previous day's safety system trials, a pattern had emerged that made his blood run cold. The emergency oxygen deployment system was failing at a rate of 3.7%, a number that sounded small until you multiplied it by the thousands of passengers who would trust their lives to these aircraft. Worse, the failures were occurring under stress conditions that weren't uncommon during actual emergencies. The system that was supposed to save lives during catastrophic decompression events was instead failing precisely when it would be needed most. Kieran had run the calculations obsessively, hoping he'd made an error. But the mathematics were unforgiving. At current failure rates, the oxygen system would malfunction on approximately 1 out of every 27 emergency deployments. For an aircraft program planning to sell over 500 units worldwide, those numbers translated to hundreds of potential deaths. He'd taken his findings to his supervisor, David Chen, whose corner office overlooked Lake Ontario and whose salary reflected 20 years of successful project management. David had listened with the patient expression of someone accustomed to managing engineering concerns. "Kieran, I appreciate your diligence," David had said after reviewing the data. "But we need to keep this in perspective. These are preliminary numbers from testing conditions that are more extreme than anything these aircraft will encounter in service. Real-world deployment rates will be significantly lower." "David, these are exactly the conditions these systems will face during actual emergencies," Kieran had protested. "We can't certify a safety system that fails when people need it most." David's expression had grown more guarded. "The certification timeline for this program has already been established. Delaying production for additional testing would cost millions of dollars and potentially compromise Bombardier's competitive position in the regional aircraft market." "How much does it cost when an aircraft full of passengers loses cabin pressure and the oxygen system fails?" Kieran had asked quietly. The conversation had ended with David promising to take it under advisement and suggesting that Kieran focus on solutions rather than problems. But 3 weeks later, when Kieran had received the official notification that his safety concerns had been thoroughly reviewed and determined to be within acceptable parameters, he'd faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. Keep his mouth shut, collect his paycheck, and hope that the 3.7% failure rate remained theoretical. Or speak up and accept the consequences. The decision hadn't been difficult, though the aftermath had been more devastating than he'd imagined. Kieran had documented his findings meticulously, submitted formal safety reports through official channels, and when those were ignored, he'd contacted Transport Canada's Aviation Safety Directorate. The investigation had taken 8 months, during which Kieran had been placed on administrative leave, while Bombardier's legal team worked to contain the damage. When Transport Canada's final report confirmed Kieran's findings and ordered a complete redesign of the oxygen deployment system, it had been too late to save his career. The aerospace industry was surprisingly small, and word traveled fast about engineers who caused expensive problems for major manufacturers. Despite being vindicated by the official investigation, despite ultimately saving hundreds of lives through his whistleblowing, Kieran had found himself unemployable in the field he'd spent 15 years mastering. The job offers had dried up, the professional networks had gone silent. The colleagues who'd once sought his expertise had suddenly become unavailable when he'd called asking for referrals. In less than a year, Kieran Walsh had gone from respected engineer to industry pariah, his reputation destroyed by the simple act of choosing integrity over convenience. The final blow had come 6 months after Transport Canada's ruling, when his wife Sarah had sat him down in their Rosedale living room for a conversation that still echoed in his memory. "I can't do this anymore, Kieran," she'd said, her voice carrying 3 years of accumulated exhaustion. "I've tried to be supportive, but watching you destroy your career for principles that nobody else seems to care about is tearing me apart." "Sarah, those principles saved lives," Kieran had replied, though his voice had lacked conviction even to his own ears. "And what about our life?" she'd asked. "What about our plans for children, for building something together? You chose strangers over your own family, and I can't pretend that doesn't hurt." The divorce had been swift and clinical, dividing assets that had already been decimated by legal fees and lost income. Sarah had kept the house. She'd been the one with stable employment after all. And Kieran had moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in Scarborough, trading his BMW for a used Honda Civic and his expensive suits for work clothes that wouldn't show stains. But life had delivered one more devastating blow. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, Sarah had been driving home from her law firm when a drunk driver had run a red light at the intersection of Bloor and Avenue Road. The accident had been instantaneous and unsurvivable, leaving Kieran to grapple not only with the loss of the woman he'd loved, but with the responsibility of raising their 7-year-old daughter Sage alone. Sage had been the surprise that had changed everything 3 years into their marriage, when Sarah had finally convinced Kieran that they were financially and emotionally ready for children. She was a perfect blend of both parents. Kieran's analytical mind wrapped in Sarah's boundless curiosity, with green eyes that matched her father's and a smile that could light up rooms. The night of Sarah's funeral, as Kieran had tucked Sage into bed in their tiny Scarborough apartment, his daughter had asked the question that would haunt him for months. "Daddy, are you going to leave me too?" "Never," Kieran had whispered, holding her small hand in the darkness. "We're a team now, Sage. Whatever happens, we face it together." Keeping that promise had required sacrifices that most people couldn't imagine. Kieran had taken whatever work he could find, night security guard, warehouse worker, finally settling into the janitorial job at First Canadian Place that allowed him to work while Sage slept and be home when she needed him. The mathematics of single parenthood in Toronto were unforgiving. Rent for their 1-bedroom apartment consumed 60% of Kieran's income. Childcare for the hours when his work schedule overlapped with Sage's needs took another 20%. Food, clothing, utilities, and transportation carved up the remaining 20% with surgical precision, leaving no room for emergencies, entertainment, or the kind of childhood experiences that other parents took for granted. But Kieran had learned to find dignity in work that others considered beneath them. He took pride in leaving every office spotless, in ensuring that Toronto's business leaders arrived each morning to workspaces that gleamed with professional polish. He understood that respect wasn't about job titles or salary figures. It was about doing whatever work you had with integrity and competence. 3 afternoons a week, Sage joined him at First Canadian Place after her elementary school day ended. The building's security team had grown fond of the bright 7-year-old who could entertain herself for hours with coloring books and educational apps while her father completed his evening rounds. She'd set up a small study area in the custodial break room on the 30th floor, transforming the utilitarian space into her own private library. It was on one of those afternoons 6 months earlier that Kieran had first encountered Phoenix Thorne. He'd been restocking cleaning supplies in the 37th floor supply closet when he'd heard it. A soft sound that didn't belong in the sterile quiet of executive country. Someone was crying, the kind of muffled sobbing that suggested someone trying very hard not to be heard. Kieran had found the boy in a conference room that overlooked the financial district, a small figure hunched in a leather chair that dwarfed his tiny frame. The child couldn't have been more than 9, wearing clothes that probably cost more than Kieran's monthly grocery budget, but expensive fabric couldn't hide the sadness that seemed to radiate from him like heat. "Hey, buddy," Kieran had said softly, approaching the way he would a startled animal. "You okay up here?" The boy had looked up, surprised to be found. His face was blotchy with tears, his nose running, and he clutched a sketchbook against his chest like armor. But his eyes, intelligent green eyes that seemed far too old for his face, had assessed Kieran with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to evaluate adults quickly. "I'm not supposed to be in here," the boy had whispered. "Well," Kieran had said, settling into the chair beside him, "sometimes we all end up places we're not supposed to be. That doesn't make us bad people." He'd pulled a package of tissues from his supply cart and offered them to the boy, who'd accepted them gratefully. Kieran had waited while the child wiped his face and blew his nose, not rushing, not asking invasive questions, just being present in the way that parents learn to be. "I'm Kieran," he'd said finally. "What's your name?" "Phoenix," had come the quiet response. It was a beautiful name, unusual and strong. Kieran had filed it away along with the observation that this clearly wasn't an ordinary situation. Children Phoenix's age didn't typically wander the executive floors of major office towers at 8 p.m. on a Thursday night. "That's a great name," Kieran had said simply. "Like the bird that rises from ashes, right? My daughter would love that. She's really into mythology and stories about magical creatures." Phoenix had looked up with sudden interest. "You have a daughter?" "I do. Her name is Sage, and she's 7. She's probably downstairs right now, turning our break room into a science laboratory with whatever supplies she can find." For the first time since Kieran had found him, Phoenix had smiled. A real smile, not the polite mask that most adults would have seen. What kind of science? Whatever catches her interest that day. Last week she was trying to figure out which cleaning chemicals change color when you mix them with water. Before that, she was building structures with paper cups to see how high she could stack them before they fell over. Phoenix had opened his sketchbook and showed Kieran a detailed drawing of Toronto's skyline as seen from the conference room window. The technical skill was impressive for someone his age, but it was the emotional quality of the piece that had taken Kieran's breath away. The buildings looked lonely against a gray sky, isolated and cold despite their impressive height. "This is beautiful," Kieran had said, meaning it. "You're really talented." "I like drawing what I see," Phoenix had replied. "Sometimes it helps me understand things better." "That makes sense. Art is another way of thinking, isn't it? Like math or science, but for feelings and ideas that are harder to measure." They'd talked for 20 more minutes about art and science and why some buildings looked friendly while others looked intimidating. Kieran had learned that Phoenix's mom worked very important business meetings that kept her at the office late, and Phoenix had learned that Kieran's daughter was waiting downstairs with homework that might need help. "Would you like to meet her?" Kieran had asked as he prepared to continue his rounds. Sage loves meeting new people, and she's always excited when someone shares her interest in figuring out how things work. Phoenix had nodded eagerly, and that simple decision had changed everything for both families. The friendship that developed over the following months had been natural and uncomplicated in the way that the best relationships often are. 3 afternoons a week, Phoenix would finish his tutoring sessions and wander down to the 30th floor, where Sage would be waiting with whatever educational project had captured her imagination that day. They'd built paper airplane competitions to test aerodynamics. They'd conducted careful experiments with different cleaning supplies to understand chemical reactions. They'd used the break room's small window to to study constellations, with Kieran pointing out different star patterns and explaining the stories behind their names. But mostly, they just talked. About school and friends and parents and the kinds of questions that occupied young minds trying to make sense of an adult world. Kieran had found himself looking forward to these conversations almost as much as the children did, discovering in Phoenix an intelligence and wisdom that had been shaped by experiences no 9-year-old should have to navigate alone. Phoenix never mentioned his last name, and Kieran never asked. To him, Phoenix was simply a bright, thoughtful kid, whose mother worked late and who seemed hungry for the kind of authentic adult attention that had nothing to do with achievements or expectations. Kieran had no idea that the boy he was teaching about constellations was the son of one of Canada's most powerful CEOs. He didn't know that Phoenix's mother was being courted by 5 of Toronto's most accomplished men. He certainly didn't know that his friendship with a lonely 9-year-old would eventually challenge everything Toronto's elite thought they knew about love, family, and what really mattered in life. All he knew was that Phoenix and Sage brought light to the fluorescent-lit corridors of First Canadian Place, and that sometimes the most important work you could do had nothing to do with your job description. There's something special about people who choose what's right over what's easy. Have you ever met someone who lost everything but kept their character? Share their story in the comments below. The November rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Celeste's corner office, like nature's reminder that even the most successful people couldn't control everything. At 9:30 p.m. on a Thursday night, the 37th floor of Thorne Innovations Tower was supposed to be empty, except for the overnight security staff and the cleaning crew that kept Toronto's business district running smoothly. Celeste had been reviewing quarterly projections for their European expansion, the kind of detailed financial analysis that required absolute concentration and usually kept her at the office until well past Phoenix's bedtime. It was the price of building an empire, she told herself, the endless hours that separated successful entrepreneurs from people who simply dreamed about success. But tonight, something felt different. Maybe it was the way the rain sounded against the windows, like tears sliding down glass. Maybe it was the photograph on her desk, Phoenix at age 3, laughing as he helped her mix cookie batter in their old apartment kitchen, that seemed to accuse her every time she looked up from her laptop. Or maybe it was Dr. Sterling's voice echoing in her memory. When did you last have a conversation with your son that wasn't about schedules or achievements? Celeste closed her laptop with more force than necessary and decided to check on Phoenix. He'd been spending his after-tutoring hours in one of the conference rooms working on homework while she finished her daily meetings. At 9 years old, he was remarkably self-sufficient. But even self-sufficient children shouldn't be left alone in office buildings until 10 p.m. The 37th floor felt different in the evening, when the artificial energy of business hours had drained away and left behind only the soft hum of ventilation systems and the distant sounds of a city settling into night. Celeste's heels clicked against polished marble as she walked toward the East Conference Room, where she expected to find Phoenix bent over mathematics worksheets or science projects. Instead, she found the conference room empty, Phoenix's backpack and jacket neatly arranged on one chair. But no sign of her son. A flutter of panic rose in her chest as she checked the other conference rooms, the break areas, even the bathrooms. Phoenix was methodical and responsible. He didn't wander without purpose or permission. He certainly didn't disappear from secure office buildings without explanation. It wasn't until she heard the distant sound of laughter, genuine, delighted laughter that she recognized as her son's voice, that Celeste realized Phoenix had ventured beyond the executive floors. She followed the sound to the elevator bank, her concern shifting to confusion as she pressed the button for the 30th floor. The custodial break room was located there, she remembered from building schematics. But why would Phoenix be interested in janitorial facilities? The elevator doors opened to reveal a different world from the executive suites above. Here, fluorescent lighting replaced crystal chandeliers, industrial carpeting covered the floors instead of marble, and the air smelled of cleaning supplies and honest work. But what stopped Celeste in her tracks wasn't the utilitarian decor. It was the scene unfolding in the break room at the end of the corridor. Through the partially open door, she could see Phoenix sitting cross-legged on the floor beside a man in a custodial uniform. Both of them bent over what appeared to be a complex construction project involving paper cups, rubber bands, and various office supplies. A little girl with dark curls was carefully measuring distances with a ruler, calling out numbers that Phoenix dutifully recorded in a notebook. "Okay, Phoenix, try this one," the girl was saying with the kind of scientific seriousness that belonged in a research laboratory. "If we add 2 more rubber bands to the base structure, do you think it'll hold more weight or just fall over faster?" "I think it depends on the distribution of stress points," Phoenix replied, his voice more animated than Celeste had heard it in months. "But let's test it experimentally rather than just guessing." The man in the custodial uniform, tall, dark-haired, probably in his mid-30s, looked up at Phoenix with genuine interest. "That's good thinking. In engineering, we call that empirical testing. You form a hypothesis, design an experiment, and then see what the data tells you." "Were you an engineer?" Phoenix asked with the directness that only children could manage. The man paused, his expression growing more guarded. "A long time ago. Now I'm just someone who helps keep this building clean so smart people like you and your mom can focus on important work." Celeste felt something catch in her throat at the dignity in his voice, the way he spoke about janitorial work without shame or self-pity. There was something about his manner, patient, intelligent, completely focused on the children's experiment. That felt different from the carefully managed interactions Phoenix had been having with her potential suitors. She was about to announce her presence when Phoenix said something that made her freeze in place. "Kieran, can I tell you something? My mom is trying to find me a new dad, but all the men she wants me to meet talk to me like I'm a job interview they're trying to pass." The man, Kieran, set down the paper cup structure and gave Phoenix his full attention. "That sounds frustrating. How does it make you feel when people talk to you that way?" Phoenix was quiet for a moment, considering the question with characteristic seriousness. "Like they're trying to figure out what answers will make me approve of them, instead of just wanting to know what I actually think." "And what do you actually think?" Kieran asked gently. "I think maybe I don't want a new dad who has to practice being nice to me," Phoenix said simply. "I think maybe I want someone who's already nice to me because they want to be, not because they're supposed to be." The little girl, Sage, Celeste remembered from Phoenix's earlier comment, looked up from her measurements. "Like how daddy's nice to you because you're Phoenix, not because you're somebody important's son?" Celeste felt the words hit her like a physical blow. Here was her brilliant, perceptive son, having the kind of authentic conversation she'd been trying to facilitate through careful matchmaking and strategic relationship building. But he was having it with the building's janitor, a man whose name she didn't even know, in a break room that smelled of industrial cleaning supplies. "Nan?" Phoenix had noticed her standing in the doorway, his expression shifting from open enthusiasm to careful politeness. The mask he wore when switching between his real self and the version he thought adults wanted to see. Kieran stood immediately, his posture respectful but not subservient. The little girl jumped up beside him, suddenly shy in the presence of someone whose expensive clothes and commanding presence clearly marked her as important. "Mrs." Kieran began, extending his hand in greeting. "Thorne?" Celeste supplied, accepting the handshake and trying to process the conflict between what she was seeing and what she'd expected to find. "Celeste Thorne. I'm Phoenix's mother." She watched recognition dawn in Kieran's eyes, the realization that the lonely boy he'd befriended was the son of Thorne Innovation's CEO, that the casual friendship he'd been nurturing existed across a class divide that most people would consider unbridgeable. "I'm Kieran Walsh," he said simply. "Phoenix and Sage have been keeping me company during my evening rounds. I hope that's been okay. Phoenix mentioned his mom worked late, but I didn't realize that his mom was your boss." Celeste finished, noting the way Kieran's manner remained unchanged despite learning her identity. No sudden deference, no calculating smile, just the same quiet dignity he'd displayed when she'd observed him interacting with the children. "I was just about to come get you, Mom," Phoenix said, moving to stand beside Kieran in a gesture of subtle solidarity that Celeste found both touching and concerning. "Kieran and Sage have been teaching me about structural engineering. Did you know that the CN Tower uses the same architectural principles as the paper cup towers we've been building?" Celeste looked at the elaborate construction project scattered across the break room floor. Dozens of carefully balanced structures in various states of completion, each one labeled with notes about weight distribution, foundation stability, and height-to-base ratios. It was more sophisticated than most science fair projects she'd seen, but what struck her wasn't the technical complexity, it was Phoenix's obvious engagement with the process. "This is quite impressive," she said, meaning it. "How long have you been working on this?" "About 3 weeks," Sage piped up, overcoming her shyness with the enthusiasm of a 7-year-old sharing a favorite project. "We started with just regular towers, but then Phoenix had the idea to test different base configurations, and Daddy suggested we document everything so we could compare results scientifically." Celeste looked at Kieran, seeing him with new eyes. This wasn't just a janitor who happened to be good with children. This was someone with genuine knowledge and teaching ability, someone who'd managed to spark Phoenix's curiosity in ways that expensive tutors and educational consultants had failed to achieve. "You mentioned you were an engineer," she said carefully. "What kind of engineering?" Kieran's expression grew guarded again, the same careful look she'd seen earlier when Phoenix had asked the same question. "Aerospace, originally. Safety systems design, but that was a different life." There was clearly a story there, one that involved the kind of career change that didn't happen by choice. But before Celeste could probe further, Phoenix had moved to stand between them, with the protective instinct of someone who'd learned to guard the relationships that mattered to him. "Kieran's been teaching me about constellations too," Phoenix said with deliberate subject change. "Did you know that Polaris isn't actually the brightest star in the sky, but it's the most useful for navigation because it doesn't move?" "I didn't know that," Celeste admitted, noting the way her son's face lit up when discussing what he'd learned. When was the last time she'd seen him this excited about anything? When was the last time he'd shared discoveries with her, instead of simply completing assignments? "Just like people," Sage added, with the profound simplicity that sometimes came from children. "The most useful people aren't always the flashiest ones. Sometimes they're just the ones who stay steady when everything else is moving around." The observation hung in the air like a challenge, and Celeste found herself studying Kieran with new attention. He wasn't flashy. His uniform was clean but obviously second-hand, his work boots re-soled rather than replaced, his manner quietly competent rather than commanding. But Phoenix had clearly found something in this man that he hadn't found in 5 accomplished suitors who looked perfect on paper. "It's getting late," Celeste said finally, though she was reluctant to end what was clearly the most genuine conversation she'd witnessed Phoenix have in months. "We should probably head home." Phoenix's face fell, the quick disappointment of someone who'd been enjoying himself and didn't want the experience to end. "Can I come back tomorrow? Sage and I haven't finished testing the earthquake simulation model." "Earthquake simulation?" Celeste asked. Kieran smiled, the first completely relaxed expression she'd seen from him. "We've been exploring how different foundation designs respond to lateral stress. It's actually quite relevant to real earthquake engineering, just on a smaller scale." "Please, Mom?" Phoenix asked with more enthusiasm than he'd shown for anything in recent memory. "I promise I'll finish all my homework first." Looking at her son's hopeful face, at the creative chaos of engineering projects spread across the break room floor, at the easy camaraderie between two children who'd found friendship across economic and social boundaries, Celeste felt something shift in her understanding of what Phoenix actually needed. "Okay," she said, surprising herself with the decision. "But I'd like to meet you both properly first. Would you be interested in having dinner with us sometime? Phoenix has told me so much about his friends Kieran and Sage, and I'd love to get to know you better." The invitation hung in the air like a bridge extending across a canyon neither of them had expected to cross. Kieran looked uncertain, clearly aware of the complications that came with socializing across class lines, especially when children were involved. But Phoenix's face had transformed with joy, and Sage was bouncing on her toes with excitement. And sometimes the right decision was the one that made children smile, rather than the one that made logical sense. "We'd be honored," Kieran said finally, his formality covering what Celeste suspected was genuine nervousness about dining with a CEO who could buy and sell his entire life several times over. As they gathered up the engineering projects and prepared to leave, Celeste found herself watching the easy interaction between her son and this unexpected friend he'd discovered in the most unlikely place. Phoenix was different around Kieran, more relaxed, more curious, more genuinely himself, rather than the perfectly behaved child he'd learned to be in most adult company. Maybe Dr. Sterling had been right about Phoenix needing positive male role models. But maybe she'd been wrong about needing to find them through strategic matchmaking and careful vetting processes. Maybe the best relationships couldn't be planned or purchased or optimized for compatibility. Maybe they just had to be discovered, one conversation at a time, in the spaces where real people met each other without pretense or agenda. As the elevator carried them back to the 37th floor, Phoenix chattered excitedly about earthquake engineering and constellation navigation, more animated than Celeste had seen him in months. And for the first time since beginning her search for the perfect father figure, she wondered if she'd been looking in entirely the wrong direction. The CN Tower's 360 restaurant rotated with mechanical precision above Toronto's glittering landscape, each slow revolution offering diners a new perspective of the city, spread out below like a circuit board made of light. The November evening was crisp and clear, Lake Ontario stretching toward the horizon like black glass reflecting the moon, the financial district's towers standing sentinel over a metropolitan area that housed nearly 3 million souls. Inside the restaurant, 150 of those souls represented the absolute pinnacle of Canadian achievement. CEOs whose decisions affected thousands of employees, politicians whose policies shaped provincial futures, cultural leaders whose opinions influenced national conversations. They had gathered tonight for what society columnists had been describing as the social event of the season, Celeste Thorne's long-awaited announcement of her romantic choice. The 5 candidates stood at strategic positions throughout the dining room, each one a masterpiece of masculine accomplishment, dressed in evening wear that cost more than most people's monthly salaries. Dr. Atlas Morrison's surgical precision was evident even in the way he held his champagne flute. Ronan Blackwood's investment banker confidence radiated from his perfectly fitted tuxedo. Ezra Wellington's artistic sophistication was displayed in his choice of vintage cufflinks. Dashiell Frost's athletic grace was apparent in his posture. Quinlan Reed's environmental lawyer intensity glowed quietly from his corner near the windows. Any woman would be fortunate to marry one of them. That's what everyone had been saying for months, as Toronto's social scene had followed the courtship like a particularly sophisticated reality television show. Celeste stood at the head table in a midnight blue Valentino gown that had been featured in 3 fashion magazines, her appearance flawless despite the anxiety that had been building in her chest all day. The past month had been a whirlwind of final dates, careful consideration, and pressure from advisors who reminded her constantly that this decision would affect not just her personal life, but her company's public image and Phoenix's future stability. The logical choice was clear. Each man brought something valuable to the potential partnership. Each had demonstrated genuine interest in Phoenix and understanding of the complexities involved in blended family dynamics. Each represented the kind of strategic alliance that successful people made when building lives that required both emotional and practical compatibility. But logic felt increasingly irrelevant as Celeste watched her son sitting at the children's table near the stage, his small figure almost lost in a tuxedo that had been tailored by the same Savile Row expert who dressed members of Parliament. Phoenix wore the polite expression he'd perfected for public events, attentive but distant, engaged but somehow untouchable. 3 weeks had passed since that evening in the custodial break room. 3 weeks during which Phoenix had spent every possible moment with Kieran and Sage, building engineering projects and learning about astronomy and having conversations that left him more animated and curious than Celeste had seen him in years. She'd had dinner with Kieran twice since that first encounter. Once at an upscale Yorkville restaurant where he'd been obviously uncomfortable with the formal service and elaborate presentations, and once at a family pizza place in Scarborough where Phoenix and Sage had built architectural masterpieces out of breadsticks, while the adults discussed everything from aerospace engineering to single parenthood to the challenge of maintaining dignity when life doesn't go according to plan. Kieran Walsh was nothing like the men she'd been considering for marriage. He worked with his hands, struggled to pay rent on a Scarborough apartment, and carried the kind of financial uncertainty that kept people awake at night worrying about utility bills and grocery budgets. He was also intelligent, principled, and possessed a natural ability to connect with Phoenix that made her 5 accomplished suitors look like they were reading from scripts. But this was Toronto's elite gathering to witness her choice, and Kieran was 37 floors below, working his custodial shift and completely unaware that his name had been mentioned in several recent conversations between Celeste and her increasingly confused son. "Ladies and gentlemen," Celeste began, lifting her champagne flute as conversations gradually died and attention focused on the head table. "Thank you all for joining us tonight for what I hope will be a celebration of new beginnings and, Mom?" Phoenix's voice cut through her carefully rehearsed speech like a child's honesty through adult pretense. He'd stood up from the children's table and was walking toward the microphone with the kind of determined expression that had always preceded his most memorable decisions. The room fell silent with the sudden completeness that only happened when 150 powerful people simultaneously realized they were about to witness something unscripted. Camera flashes paused mid-pop. Wine glasses stopped halfway to lips. Even the soft jazz trio seemed to miss a beat. Celeste felt her heart begin to race as Phoenix reached the small stage. This wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't how carefully orchestrated announcements were supposed to unfold. But her son's expression was so focused, so certain, that she found herself stepping aside to let him approach the microphone. "Hi, everyone," Phoenix said, his 9-year-old voice carrying clearly through the restaurant's sophisticated sound system. He looked out at the assembled crowd with the same analytical attention he brought to mathematics problems, his gaze moving across faces that represented billions of dollars in collective net worth. "My mom asked me to help her choose someone to marry," Phoenix continued with the matter-of-fact directness that had always made adults underestimate him. "She found 5 really nice men who are all successful and smart and would probably make good husbands for somebody." Murmurs began to ripple through the crowd as people realized this wasn't going to be a conventional romantic announcement. The 5 candidates' expressions shifted from confident anticipation to careful uncertainty. "But I want to choose someone different," Phoenix said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I want to choose someone who doesn't try to impress me with expensive presents or educational opportunities. Someone who just likes spending time with me because I'm me, not because I'm Celeste Thorne's son." Celeste felt the blood drain from her face as she realized where this was heading. Around the dining room, she could see reporters reaching for notebooks, society photographers adjusting their cameras, and 150 of Toronto's most influential people leaning forward to hear what came next. "The person I choose is Kieran Walsh," Phoenix announced, his words dropping into the elegant silence like stones into still water. "He's not here tonight because he's downstairs working. He cleans this building so people like us can have fancy dinners in clean restaurants." The silence that followed was so complete that Celeste could hear her own pulse thundering in her ears, could hear the soft mechanical hum of the restaurant's rotation, could hear the distant whisper of November wind against the windows 37 floors above the city. Phoenix looked directly at his mother, his green eyes reflecting both love and gentle reproach. "Kieran doesn't know I'm up here saying this," He thinks I'm just some kid whose mom works late. But he still takes time to teach me about stars and science and why doing the right thing matters more than being successful. Camera flashes began to pop like fireworks as photographers captured every moment of what was clearly becoming Toronto's social upset of the decade. Celeste could see the 5 candidates processing their public rejection with varying degrees of grace, could hear the rustle of expensive fabric as 150 people shifted in their seats to get better views of the unfolding drama. But all she could focus on was her son, standing at the microphone with the quiet courage of someone speaking an uncomfortable truth to a room full of people who were accustomed to hearing only what they wanted to hear. All these men want to marry my mom because she's successful and pretty and would make them look good at parties like this. Phoenix continued, his voice never wavering despite the magnitude of what he was doing. But Kieran just wants to be my friend. He doesn't want anything from us, except maybe help with his daughter's science fair project. The revelation that the janitor had a daughter sent another wave of whispers through the crowd. This was becoming more complex and interesting than anyone had expected. I know this is probably embarrassing for Mom, Phoenix said, finally acknowledging the social chaos he'd created. But I couldn't let her marry someone just because it made sense on paper, when I know there's someone who makes sense in my heart. He paused, looking out at the sea of stunned faces with the same intensity he'd shown earlier when studying the Toronto skyline. My real dad left when things got hard. These men all want to marry Mom when things are easy. But Kieran helps people even when nobody's watching, even when it doesn't help him at all. That's what I want in a dad, someone who does the right thing because it's right, not because he's trying to win something. The silence that followed Phoenix's declaration felt like the moment between lightning and thunder, electrically charged and full of inevitable consequences. Then chaos erupted. Reporters surged forward with questions shouted over each other. Camera flashes turned the elegant dining room into a strobe-lit nightmare. The 5 rejected suitors stood frozen in various poses of shock and dignified disappointment. Guests pulled out phones to capture video that would be shared across social media within minutes. Celeste felt herself moving through the pandemonium like she was underwater, everything muffled and surreal. Her first instinct was to protect Phoenix from the media circus he'd inadvertently created. But as she reached him, she saw something in his expression that stopped her cold. He wasn't upset or frightened by the chaos he'd caused. He was relieved. For the first time in months, possibly years, Phoenix looked like a child who'd finally said what he really meant, instead of what adults wanted to hear. The careful politeness was gone, replaced by the kind of authentic emotional expression that Celeste realized she'd been missing without knowing it. "Mom," Phoenix said, reaching for her hand as security personnel began clearing a path through the crowd of reporters and photographers. "I'm sorry I embarrassed you, but I couldn't pretend anymore." Celeste knelt down to his eye level, ignoring the camera flashes and shouted questions, focusing entirely on her son's face. "What do you mean, pretend?" "Pretend that I wanted a new dad who felt like a business meeting," Phoenix said simply. "Pretend that having expensive things was better than having someone who actually cares about me." The words hit Celeste like a physical blow, forcing her to confront the reality that her sophisticated approach to relationship building had completely missed what her son actually needed. She'd been so focused on finding the right qualifications that she'd overlooked the importance of the right connection. Security was urging them toward the elevators, away from the media frenzy that showed no signs of calming down. But as they moved through the crowd, Celeste found herself thinking not about the public relations disaster Phoenix had just created, but about the conversation they needed to have with a janitor who had no idea he'd just become the most talked-about man in Toronto. Can you imagine the courage it took for a 9-year-old to speak his truth to a room full of powerful adults? Hit that subscribe button if you believe children sometimes see what adults miss completely. The headline in the Toronto Star the next morning read, "Tech CEO's son chooses janitor over elite suitors in CN Tower bombshell." By noon, The story had been picked up by CBC, CTV, and Global News. By evening, CNN was running segments about the Toronto Cinderella story, and social media was exploding with hashtags like Phoenix Choice and Love Over Logic. Kieran Walsh learned about his unexpected fame the way most working-class people discover they've become internet celebrities, through a text message from his sister that simply read, "Turn on the news, now." He'd been sitting in his Scarborough apartment at 7 a.m., helping Sage with her breakfast, while CNN's morning show played in the background. The story came on during a commercial break for cereal, sandwiched between weather updates and traffic reports. Like it was just another piece of daily news, rather than something that would change his life forever. 9-year-old Phoenix Thorne shocked Toronto's elite last night when he publicly rejected his mother's 5 accomplished suitors in favor of the building janitor who had befriended him. Kieran had felt the world tilt sideways as grainy cell phone footage showed Phoenix standing at a microphone in the CN Tower's 360 restaurant, speaking with the quiet courage of someone far older than his years. The boy he'd been teaching about constellations was addressing a room full of people whose combined net worth could fund small countries. The child's mother, Thorne Innovations CEO Celeste Thorne, appeared stunned by her son's declaration, which has sparked international conversation about class, authenticity, and what children really need from the adults in their lives. "Daddy?" Sage had looked up from her cereal with the concerned expression of a 7-year-old who'd sensed that something important was happening. "Why is Phoenix on TV?" Kieran had stared at the screen, watching Phoenix speak words that would be analyzed by sociologists and relationship experts for weeks to come. The boy's declaration of friendship had been transformed into a media sensation that was already generating commentary about everything from single parenthood to economic inequality to the nature of modern romance. His phone had started ringing before the news segment ended. The first call had been from his building supervisor, wanting to know if he needed time off to handle the situation. The second had been from a reporter at the Globe and Mail asking for an exclusive interview. By 10 a.m., there had been 17 more calls from various media outlets, 3 offers for book deals, and 2 invitations to appear on afternoon talk shows. Kieran had turned off his phone and tried to explain to Sage why reporters were calling about their friendship with Phoenix. But how do you tell a 7-year-old that private relationships sometimes become public entertainment? The knock on his apartment door at 2 p.m. had been soft but insistent. Through the peephole, Kieran had seen Celeste Thorne standing in his building's narrow hallway, wearing jeans and a simple sweater instead of the business attire he associated with her. She looked tired, like she hadn't slept, and she was alone. "I'm sorry to just show up," Celeste had said when he opened the door. "But I needed to talk to you, and your phone seems to be off." Kieran had let her into his modest apartment, acutely aware of the contrast between his second-hand furniture and her obvious wealth. The living room was clean but cramped, dominated by Sage's art projects and the kind of practical furniture that prioritized durability over style. "Where's Phoenix?" Sage had asked immediately, appearing from her bedroom with hopeful eyes. "He's at school," Celeste had replied, kneeling down to Sage's eye level with natural ease. "But I wanted to talk to your dad about what happened last night." Sage had nodded seriously, then disappeared back to her room to give the adults privacy for whatever important conversation was about to unfold. "I owe you an apology," Celeste had said, settling carefully on Kieran's worn couch. "Phoenix put you in an impossible situation, and I'm sorry you're dealing with the media attention because of something he said without consulting anyone." Kieran had studied her face, seeing exhaustion and genuine concern, rather than the calculating expression he might have expected from someone whose reputation had been complicated by a 9-year-old's honesty. "He's a good kid, Celeste. He was just speaking his truth." "His truth has created a nightmare for you," Celeste had replied, gesturing toward his disconnected phone. "Reporters are probably camped outside your building. Your privacy has been completely destroyed because my son decided to make a public declaration about people he cares about." "And how do you feel about his choice?" Kieran had asked quietly, The question had hung in the air between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Celeste had been quiet for a long moment, looking around his small apartment with the attention of someone seeing her son's friend's world for the first time. "I think," she'd said finally, "that Phoenix sees things I've been missing." Over the next 2 hours, they'd had the kind of conversation that might have taken months to develop under normal circumstances. Celeste had talked about the pressure of being a successful single mother, about the loneliness of making every decision alone, about the fear that she was failing Phoenix despite providing him with every material advantage. Kieran had shared his own story, the aerospace engineering career that had ended when he'd chosen integrity over convenience, the financial struggles that had followed, the challenge of raising Sage alone while working jobs that paid bills but didn't provide much beyond basic survival. "I keep thinking about what Phoenix said," Celeste had admitted as afternoon sunlight slanted through Kieran's small windows. "About wanting someone who does the right thing because it's right, not because he's trying to win something." "Phoenix is wise," Kieran had said simply. "Sometimes kids see relationships more clearly than adults do, because they haven't learned to complicate everything with strategy and expectations." The conversation had been interrupted by Sage returning from her room with a drawing she'd made, a picture of 4 people holding hands outside what looked like the CN Tower, all of them smiling under a sky full of stars. "This is us," Sage had announced with the matter-of-fact confidence of childhood. "Phoenix told me about the fancy dinner, so I drew us all together like a family." Celeste had stared at the drawing, seeing her life reimagined through a 7-year-old's perspective. In Sage's world, the complications of class and wealth and social expectations didn't exist. There were just people who cared about each other, and that was enough to build a family. "Sage, sweetie," Celeste had said gently, "things are more complicated than that for grown-ups." "Why?" Sage had asked with the devastating directness that only children possess. Neither adult had been able to answer that question satisfactorily. The media attention had been relentless for the first week. Photographers had camped outside both Kieran's apartment building and Phoenix's school. Talk shows had debated whether Phoenix's choice represented authentic wisdom or childhood manipulation. Social media had divided into camps supporting either true love wins or inappropriate class mixing. But gradually, a more nuanced conversation had begun to emerge. Op-ed pieces in major newspapers had explored the authenticity gap in modern relationships. Sociologists had written about children's ability to see past surface accomplishments to character fundamentals. Child development experts had discussed the importance of organic relationship building versus strategic matchmaking. Phoenix had handled the attention with the same analytical approach he brought to everything else, observing the adult chaos he'd created with the detached interest of a scientist studying an experiment. When reporters had managed to corner him outside his school, he'd simply said, "I told the truth about my feelings. I don't understand why that's controversial." Kieran had been offered positions at 3 different aerospace companies, each one eager to employ the engineer whose integrity had been vindicated by public attention. Transport Canada had reopened his case file, and within 2 weeks, his professional reputation had been fully restored. The whistleblowing incident that had destroyed his career was now being cited as evidence of his character rather than his troublemaking potential. But the job offers and restored reputation felt secondary to the more important question that had been developing over weeks of careful conversation and shared time. What did 4 people who genuinely cared about each other do when the world was watching their every move? The answer they discovered was surprisingly simple. They focused on each other and ignored the world. 3 weeks after the CN Tower announcement, Celeste had made another decision that surprised Toronto's social observers. Instead of choosing one of the 5 accomplished men who'd been courting her, she'd stepped back from dating entirely to focus on what Phoenix actually needed. Not a strategic father figure, but time to build authentic relationships at his own pace. She'd also made changes to her work schedule that allowed for family dinners, homework help, and the kind of present parenting that doesn't require scheduling in advance. Thorn Innovations had continued to thrive under her leadership, but success no longer came at the cost of connection with her son. Kieran had accepted the position with Bombardier that came with public vindication, salary restoration, and the kind of professional respect he'd thought was gone forever. But more importantly, he'd found himself part of a chosen family that valued authenticity over accomplishment and character over credentials. The four of them had begun spending time together regularly, not as a romantic couple navigating courtship, but as two single parents supporting each other while their children built the kind of friendship that transcended social boundaries. Phoenix and Sage had become inseparable, their shared curiosity creating science projects that turned kitchen tables into laboratories and backyard gardens into research stations. And slowly, carefully, Celeste and Kieran had begun to explore whether the connection Phoenix had recognized so clearly might grow into something deeper and more lasting than either of them had dared to hope. 6 months after the CN Tower announcement that had made international headlines, Toronto's March wind carried the first hints of spring through High Park's awakening trees. The cherry blossoms weren't quite ready to bloom, but the promise of their arrival hung in the air like hope made tangible. Near Grenadier Pond, where families came to feed ducks and children came to discover that nature existed even in the heart of the city, 4 people had spread a blanket on the grass for what had become their weekly Saturday picnic tradition. It was a modest gathering, sandwiches made at home, thermos bottles filled with coffee and hot chocolate, nothing that would attract attention from passers-by who had no reason to recognize Canada's most famous blended family. Phoenix and Sage were crouched at the pond's edge, conducting what they called aquatic ecosystem research, but what looked more like 2 children fascinated by tadpoles and water beetles. At 10 and 8, they had developed the kind of sibling-like dynamic that transcended biological relationships, built on shared curiosity and complementary strengths. "Dad, come look at this," Sage called to Kieran, who was helping Celeste unpack their lunch from a wicker basket that had belonged to her grandmother. The word "dad" had evolved naturally over the months, as Phoenix had begun using it to describe the man who'd become the most consistent positive male presence in his life. "Mom, you need to see this too," Phoenix added, not wanting Celeste to miss whatever aquatic wonder they'd discovered. Celeste and Kieran exchanged the kind of look that passed between adults who'd learned to find joy in children's discoveries. Their relationship had developed slowly, carefully, with the patience of people who understood that the best foundations were built gradually rather than rushed. They hadn't married yet, though the question had been discussed with the practical consideration that both brought to important decisions. Kieran had finally sold his Scarborough apartment and moved into Celeste's Yorkville penthouse, a transition that had required adjustments from everyone as they learned to blend different approaches to everything from household management to parenting styles. The media attention had gradually faded as newer stories captured public imagination, but the changes it had catalyzed had become permanent improvements in all their lives. Phoenix was thriving in ways that went beyond academic achievement. He laughed more, asked questions driven by curiosity rather than obligation, and had developed friendships at school with children who shared his interests rather than his social status. Sage had blossomed under the stability that came with Kieran's restored career and expanded family structure. Her natural scientific curiosity had found encouragement from both Phoenix and Celeste, leading to a bedroom laboratory that would have impressed most graduate students and certainly worried most parents. "What did you find?" Celeste asked, settling beside the children at the pond's edge while Kieran crouched next to Phoenix. "Tadpoles," Sage announced with the excitement of someone who'd personally discovered a new species. "But look how different they are from each other. Some have tiny legs already, and others still look like fish." Phoenix pointed to a cluster of tadpoles in various stages of development. "It's like they're all becoming frogs, but at different speeds. Some are ready to change, and others need more time." "That's a beautiful observation," Kieran said, his voice carrying the kind of wonder that children recognized as genuine rather than patronizing. "In biology, we call that metamorphosis, the process of transformation from one form to another. Like butterflies? Sage asked, remembering earlier conversations about change and growth. Exactly like butterflies, Celeste confirmed. And like families, sometimes. We all start in one form, and then life changes us into something new. Phoenix looked up at her with the perceptive expression that had become his trademark. Is that what happened to us? We were all separate, and now we're transforming into a family? The question hung in the spring air, like cherry blossoms waiting to bloom. Around them, other families were enjoying their own Saturday afternoon activities. Couples walking dogs, children chasing soccer balls, teenagers practicing guitar under trees that would soon explode with pink flowers. "What do you think?" Celeste asked, using the Socratic method that had become her favorite way of helping Phoenix explore complex ideas. Phoenix considered this with characteristic seriousness, watching the tadpoles navigate their aquatic world with the determination of creatures who instinctively understood their purpose. "I think," he said finally, "that we were all fine on our own, but we're better together." "Even when it's complicated?" Kieran asked gently, acknowledging the challenges that came with blending two families that had started from such different circumstances. "Especially when it's complicated," Sage said with the confidence of someone who'd learned that the best relationships weren't the easiest ones, but the ones worth working for. Easy is boring. Complicated means you have to pay attention and care about each other. As if summoned by their conversation about transformation, a flutter of movement caught their attention. A butterfly, an early spring species that had emerged from its winter chrysalis, landed on the blanket near their picnic basket. Its wings were orange and black, marked with the kind of intricate patterns that suggested design rather than accident. Monarch butterfly, Phoenix identified quietly, not wanting to startle the creature with sudden movements. They're famous for long migrations and incredible transformations. The butterfly rested on their blanket for several minutes, as if it had been invited to join their family gathering. In the context of their conversation about change and growth, its presence felt symbolic, rather than coincidental. "You know what I love about monarch butterflies?" Celeste said, her voice soft with the kind of wonder that children brought out in adults who paid attention. "They navigate impossible distances by following patterns that scientists are still trying to understand. They don't use GPS or maps, they use instinct and trust. Like how we found each other," Sage said with the profound simplicity that sometimes emerge from young minds processing complex emotions. "Like how we found each other," Kieran agreed, reaching for Celeste's hand with the easy affection that had developed over months of shared parenting. Late-night conversations and the gradual recognition that love didn't always follow logical patterns. As the afternoon progressed and shadows began to lengthen across High Park's emerging spring landscape, the four of them packed up their picnic supplies and prepared to head home to the penthouse that had been transformed from a showplace into an actual family residence. Phoenix's artwork covered the refrigerator, Sage's science projects occupied the dining room table, and Kieran's engineering textbooks had found space alongside Celeste's business journals on shelves that now housed 2 adults' worth of accumulated knowledge. "Can we come back next week?" Phoenix asked as they walked toward the parking area where Kieran's practical Honda sat next to Celeste's luxury sedan, a visual reminder that their blended family encompassed different approaches to most aspects of life. "Absolutely," Celeste replied, noting how both children had begun to use "we" when discussing future plans, as if their family unit was now their primary identity rather than something they had to remember to include. "Maybe the tadpoles will have more legs by then," Sage suggested hopefully. "Maybe we'll see more butterflies," Phoenix added, still thinking about transformation and the mysterious processes that turned one thing into another. As they drove through Toronto's spring evening toward home, Celeste found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. A year ago, she'd been desperately seeking the right strategic partner to provide Phoenix with the father figure he needed. She'd approached the problem with spreadsheets and careful analysis, trying to optimize for compatibility and minimize risk. But Phoenix had seen what she'd missed: that the most important relationships couldn't be strategically planned or analytically optimized. They had to be discovered through authentic connection, built through daily choice, and sustained through the kind of commitment that valued character over credentials. The 5 accomplished men she'd considered for marriage had all been impressive on paper, and any of them would have provided Phoenix with advantages and opportunities that most children never receive. But none of them had offered what Kieran had given naturally, the gift of seeing Phoenix as completely acceptable, exactly as he was, without need for improvement or strategic development. That evening, after the children had completed homework and settled into their bedrooms for sleep, Celeste and Kieran sat on their balcony overlooking Toronto's skyline with cups of tea and the comfortable quiet that had become their favorite part of each day. "Any regrets?" Kieran asked, a question that had become their evening ritual, a way of checking in with each other about the enormous life changes they'd all navigated over the past months. "None," Celeste replied, meaning it completely. "You?" "Just one," Kieran said, his expression mock serious. "I wish Phoenix had chosen someone with better career prospects. Maybe a nice doctor or lawyer instead of a former aerospace engineer turned janitor turned aerospace engineer again." Celeste laughed, the sound carrying across their balcony toward a city that had been transformed by a 9-year-old's courage to speak truth in a room full of people who hadn't expected to hear it. "I think Phoenix chose exactly right," she said simply. "He chose the person who saw him, not the person who looked best with our family on paper." Below them, Toronto hummed with the energy of 3 million people living their individual stories of connection and separation, success and struggle, love found and love lost. Some of those stories would make headlines, others would be shared only within families, but all of them mattered in the complex calculus of human relationships. In their corner of the city, 4 people who had found each other across social boundaries and economic differences were building something beautiful. Not because it made logical sense, but because they had chosen each other daily through small acts of kindness, patience, and the kind of authentic care that children recognize instinctively and adults sometimes have to relearn. Phoenix's choice had indeed changed everything, just not in the ways anyone had expected. He taught the adults around him that love wasn't a strategic decision to be optimized, but a daily practice of showing up authentically for the people who mattered most. And on quiet spring evenings like this one, with tadpoles transforming in High Park ponds and butterflies navigating impossible migrations through instinct and trust, that felt like the most important lesson of all. True success isn't about having perfect credentials, it's about having perfect character. Phoenix saw what the adults missed, that integrity, kindness, and authentic connection matter more than resumes and bank accounts. What moved you most about this story? Was it Phoenix's courage, Kieran's integrity, or Celeste's growth? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that prove love comes in the most unexpected packages. Remember, the best families aren't built on paper qualifications. They're built on the daily choice to show up for each other with authenticity, respect, and unconditional love. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from getting exactly what we planned, but from being brave enough to accept what our hearts truly need. Until next time, keep believing in your own untold triumph, because your story matters and the world needs the unique light that only you can shine.